Welcome to the 15 minutes to explain what the causes of World War II are. A lot of these are going to be very familiar to you because you've already done some reading about them, but let's try and really consolidate it down. So first of all, World War II, when we look at World War II, we know that it starts in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and it's going to end in September 1945. It will be the most geographically widespread conflict. Basically, everywhere in the world is fighting. Nearly 55 million people died. That's 40 more million than World War I. That number of 55 million includes civilians as well as military personnel. So that includes the number in the Holocaust as well. Most of the countries of the world are fighting against the Axis power, which are Germany, Italy, and Japan. One of the key reasons for the treaty for World War I is the Treaty of Versailles. Now you'll remember Treaty of Versailles ended World War I. It was signed in 1918. It put most of the blame, actually all of the blame of the war onto Germany, and they faced the most severe consequences. It's probably the biggest factor when we look at why World War II started. It's from the Treaty of Versailles. The problem with it was what Germany had to do. Germany had to take full blame. Everything had to be their fault. Even though it might not have been their fault, they weren't the ones who armed up first. They weren't the ones who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but they had to take the blame. And because of that, they had to give up all their extra land and colonies, which they needed for the markets and for resources. But now they don't have that. They also had to pay reparations. That's money that you have to pay back to pay for damages you did. Well, France was really keen on Germany to pay this because France took so much damage during World War One. This is going to lead to just drastic economic stress on Germany. So German money is almost worthless, and when they needed more money, they just printed it, so it didn't have any value. So the inflation was incredible. Also, people are hungry because they can't get food in. They are starving. And their government, before World War I had ended, the Kaiser had stepped down, leaving this new democratically elected government to take all the blame for everything. And they were just never able to get better footing before all of this, the economic hardship set in. Now, the Great Depression, that's not just going to affect Germany, that affects everybody. And this is going to begin on October 29th, 1929. It actually lasts 10 years. Every economy in the world was struggling, not just Germany. And this is something that people are really facing today with the COVID-19 crisis. It's the same thing. Economies in the world are all interconnected. So just because the stock market crashed in the United States, it's going to affect everybody in the world. And we already did some reading about that. People had no work, therefore they had no income, which means they have no money to buy food. So they would stand in food lines, basically for the government or churches or social organizations, they hand them food. Governments are going to become unstable, just like we're seeing in the world today. People want their governments to solve their problems, and the governments are not necessarily equipped to do what the people need them to do. So what's going to happen is there's going to be leaders who are going to step up and say, I can fix your problems, which is what's going to lead to our fascist dictators. Fascist governments believe in very strong central government and strict control. Basically, everything that people do in society is for the government. Not so much the government for the people, but the people for the government. Most of these fascists, and today most fascist governments, are militaristic. Dictators usually run these governments, and if you are in opposition to the government and or the leader, you are often jailed or killed. It certainly was the case prior to World War II. Our most famous of the fascists, of course, is Hitler, and we've read quite a bit about him. He was not, however, the first. Italy is our first government to fall under a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, and that's going to be in 1922. And Benito Mussolini is going to name himself dictator in 1925. Now remember, when Benito gets power, he basically marches his army, all of these veterans from World War I that have no jobs and no money. He marches them into Rome and makes the king say, Benito Mussolini, will you make a new government? And he's like, yes, I will. Thank you very much. Now, in Japan, Japan is going to be in 1926. Emperor Hirohito is going to take the throne. Now things are going well. They're becoming very westernized. Again because the economy is thriving. But when the economy begins to go bad, people blame this idea of westernization and they blame the idea that Japan got soft or was trying to act more like the West. And that's when you see the military general Tojo Hideki. He's going to gain power. When he gains power, he's like, we're going to take Japan way back. We're taking it back to warrior samurai culture, and he's going to take over. So by 1941, he becomes prime minister. And even though they have an emperor, that emperor Hirohito, he really had no power. The government of Tojo has all of the power. In Germany, again, we've talked about Hitler. He's going to be the leader. 1929, the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, takes power. Hitler was in charge of them, and so he is appointed. So he is actually appointed. He is elected. The people elect his party, and his party then has the power to appoint him as Reich Chancellor, and that's in January. Well, less than a month later, there's this bombing at the Reichstag, which is like their government building. So like here would be the parliament. In the United States, it would be Congress. So it gets blown up. Now, Hitler says this is the Communist Party, and they're trying to undermine Germany because they want to take over Germany. And it just so happens the kid, or the person who they said did the bombing, was this Dutch Jewish kid. Well, most people believe now that it actually was the Nazi Party who did it, because what they do is they turn around and say, well, Hitler goes, hey guys, you know what? I'd love to find out who did this. I'd love to protect this, but I can't do it because I've got to go through all this red tape in government. So if there was just an act that I didn't have to go through government to do what I needed to do, then I could take care of business and I could protect you and keep you safe. So that's exactly what they do. They pass a law that gives Hitler total power. So the first thing he starts doing is he has all of his political opponents sent to concentration camps. And he sends them there because he's like, well, these guys are totally trying to overthrow the government. Doesn't matter that they were just trying to like, no, Hitler, we think you're bad. And he's like, nope, concentration camps for you. Then in August 1934, he names himself Führer, or the supreme leader. So why did people like him? I mean, he's a dictator. Why do people want him in charge? Because they were desperate. They had no money. Their economy was horrible. They felt really awful because the Treaty of Versailles told them they were bad. And instead of being a politician and saying things like, well, you know, this treaty was the best treaty we could hope for, he's like, no, it was crap. And the people who signed it and made us sign it, they're crap too. So people were like, yeah, that's what they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear all those bad things about other people. And Hitler was he was an amazing speaker. Like, I know when we look at him now, we're like, man, he looks like a crazy person. But back then, when people would hear him, it was like, wow, that guy has so much passion. That guy is really, he understands our pain. Now, these fascists want to start creating alliances with one another to strengthen their positions. So the first one we see is in October 15th, 1936, with Germany and Italy. They signed the Rome-German Axis. It basically says, you're cool, I'm cool, let's be cool together, everybody else is not cool. Hitler greatly admired Mussolini because he was like the first fascist, and he really liked the way he had like marched his whole army on Rome. The next one is going to be Germany and Japan. And although you're like, wasn't Hitler like a huge racist? Yeah, he was. But he also understood that he had interests in the Pacific. And if he did not make nice with Japan, he basically it would create problems for himself. The other thing this was doing, it was basically, he knew another enemy of Russia would be Japan, because they had fought a war before. So he wanted to get Japan on his side. In May 1939, Germany and Italy really formed this much stronger alliance. They call it the Pact of Steel, and it was basically no matter what, blood in, blood out. Okay, now, when in September 27th, 1940, all Germany, Italy, and Japan are now going to sign. They're going to call it. It's called the Tripartite Pact, and that solidifies those three Axis powers, right? So this is like a poster, some of the propaganda poster. Those three, those guys, that they're a team. So they want to expand their territory. Now, Japan really starts expanding. They don't have any natural resources, and so they need other. So they're industrializing, but they need stuff to industrialize. So they go after their closest neighbor, which would be China. In 1939, they take over Manchuria. They start seizing more and more Chinese lands, and then again, all of the European colonies that were in the Pacific. Now, Italy goes, and they can't really go into Europe because Germany's there. So they start going south. They go into Ethiopia and they invade Ethiopia in North Africa. Germany has this thing that they basically said we need room to grow, right? And so they first annex Austria. They basically roll their tanks into Austria and say Austria is a part of Germany now. And really, the Austrians and the Germans had been allies in World War I. So a lot of the Austrians were like, okay, but then he starts rolling into Czechoslovakia. Well, they're like, we would rather not have you here. This is in 1939. So they begin to ask England and France, are like, help us. We don't want these Germans here. And the Germans, by this point, this is our military conquest. They broke the Treaty of Versailles by starting to rearm themselves. So they've got planes and they've got tanks, and they're not afraid to use it. Now, this is where the European powers started getting the other European powers started getting really scared, because Hitler signs a pact with Stalin saying that they won't fight each other. That's scary if you're England, because you're like, well, snot, I need the Soviets or Russia to at least contain Germany a little bit, but now they've signed a treaty. This is a problem, because what it says is they're not going to attack each other. Now, Poland is in between Russia and Germany. And basically, Hitler tells Stalin, hey, look, I want to invade Poland. So if you also invade Poland, we can just share it. And then France and Britain said, look, if you guys go into Poland, we will stop you with military power. So again, the secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin, they're going to divide up Poland. So why weren't these dictators stopped? Hitler's just taking over. Why isn't anybody try to stop him? So this is policy of appeasement. First, they went through appeasement. Just means you're going to stop it through giving them what they want until they don't want anything else. The League of Nations had been working together to maintain this peace. However, they had no power. They certainly couldn't stop Japan, and Japan was like, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites because we're just doing what you guys were doing earlier. Italy was given economic sanctions, but again, the League couldn't enforce these sanctions. And then Hitler realizes that they're going to do whatever they have to do to avoid war, so he just gets more bold. Eventually, they can't ignore it anymore. And in 1939, when he invades Poland, this is where Great Britain and France both declare war on Germany. This is the beginning of World War II. And he sends in his planes, and then they send in the tanks. Poland falls very, very quickly because the Allied powers, the Britain and France, they don't actually send any troops to help. They're just like, they send a strongly worded letter. We're going to see government change in England because of this, because the guy who sponsored this whole appeasement idea of, let Hitler have Czechoslovakia, and then he won't want to take anything else. His name was Chamberlain. He gets actually thrown out of office, and that's when we see Winston Churchill come into office. So, hope you enjoyed the quick little 15-minute lesson on the causes of World War II.